This is tape 1, side 2, Sam Phillips interview, 2/23/1988.
Well, we were talking about the period when I left the University of Wyoming, having earned a regular Army commission as a second lieutenant of infantry, but I might add, by which time I had a private flying license and probably of the order of 300 hours of flying and a very strong interest in being in the Army Air Corps.
Before we leave your University of Wyoming experience, you mentioned Malcolm Craig as one individual who you had close contact with. Earlier on in your education or in other experiences, you mentioned individuals who had an impact on you. Was there any of the faculty at the University of Wyoming that you were particularly influenced by?
Oh yes, very much. H.T. Person, who was the head of the civil engineering department, and in many years later, for a brief period, was the president of the University of Wyoming. H.T. was, as I say, a civil engineer and very active in Wyoming developments involving water and conservation and that sort of thing. But he was a mathematical whiz. I can still remember his classes. He would start at the beginning of his lecture on the blackboard, and he'd have mathematics, that board full, doing mental arithmetic as he went. So I was a great admirer of him and learned a lot from him. The head of the electrical engineering department was a Professor Sechrist. He was very much an electrical machinery man and gave very boring lectures. Although he knew an awful lot about how electrical generators and electrical motors worked, and I learned enough from him to get by. I mentioned a young man earlier, a young professor who joined the faculty just before I graduated and brought with him lectures of things that were very exciting to me about how vacuum tubes worked and more electronics part of electricity. His name was Brown, and I can remember his working with me actually to prepare a paper for it was an entry for an annual meeting of the Institute of Electrical Engineers. Today, in this being 1988, there is the IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. But if you go back to the 40s, what is today IEEE was two societies. One was the IRE, International Radio Engineers, as I remember, was the IRE, and the other was the AIEE, I think, AIEE, American Institute of Electrical Engineers, and it was devoted to power. Well, the point I wanted to make, though, is that Professor Brown was helping me to prepare a paper for presentation in one of those two societies, either the IRE or AIEE, to do with radio propagation, which was not a course they were teaching, but it was related to what he was starting to bring to the curriculum there. And I can remember his bringing a 40-meter radio transmitter that he had built and setting up behind the engineering building with a variety of antenna devices that I was making to make measurements of the field radiation pattern of different kinds of antennas. So he had a lot of influence on, an effect really on my learning.
But this was the first attempt by the university to build up some expertise in radio theory and radio engineering.
Yes, that was the very beginning of starting to introduce into the curriculum something besides electrical power.
Did you have basic physics courses and basic science courses as part of the engineering curriculum?
Yes, basic physics and chemistry. And as I remember back, the physics courses were quite elementary. I suspect that my grandsons today in high school physics are probably studying, in some respects, more advanced things than I was studying in college at the University of Wyoming in the 40s. Just an interesting point of reference. The student body of the University of Wyoming in the year I graduated equaled the year 1942. The number of us that graduated in electrical engineering was probably like 5. The classes were small compared to...
Was there a separate engineering school at
Yes.
the university?
Yes, there was an engineering school, and I wanted to mention the Dean of Engineering, who was and I can't remember his name now, but the thing I remember most about him was his willingness to be a cosigner on a note where I found it necessary to borrow a few dollars in order to stay in school. And by that time, I'd become quite active in the Kappa Sigma fraternity, which I joined at the urging of a close friend, and wound up being quite active in that fraternity, and wound up being the president of the chapter there while I was in school. And I might add, in later years, was the international president of the fraternity. But through that fraternity, the fraternity had an endowment fund which members of the fraternity could apply for student loans. But the applications needed to be co-signed by some responsible person. And I can remember asking the dean of the engineering college to co-sign, which he was willing to do.
I assume then your scholarship, did it continue through all 4 years?
It continued through the 4 years, but all it provided for was the tuition. It did not provide for any of the room and board or other costs, but it did cover the tuition costs, which, though were low by today's standards, nevertheless were significant for me, and coming from a family of the means that my family had.
So I assume that for the remainder of it, you didn't receive any assistance from your family and were essentially responsible yourself.
Yes.
For coming up for the remainder.
That's true. And I had a variety of jobs there on the side at the university. For quite some period, I worked in the student union building, which was newly built while I was a student. And I wound up being the manager of the soda fountain, which which provided a certain amount of income, but it also provided a certain amount of food.
Not nutritional food.
But food nevertheless.
That's right. So what were your initial responsibilities and activities when you joined the Army as a second lieutenant?
Well, I was ordered to active duty to report to Fort Benning. June 11th, 1942 was my reporting date, as I recall. And my initial assignment was to go through the infantry school there at Fort Benning, which was a 3-month course of concentrated training for lieutenants in infantry tactics. So my initial assignment was that, and I can remember it was a very concentrated, comprehensive course in what second lieutenants and needed to know to lead a platoon and succeed to company command in the infantry. As an important incidental, the girl that I had gone with for many years from Wyoming, I talked into coming to Fort Benning in 1942, and we were married there in Columbus, Georgia, at Fort Benning in August 15th of 1942. As I say, that was an important incidental to my initial Army assignment. When I should backtrack and say that before I was ordered to active duty, I had already applied for transfer to the Army Air Corps because of my interests that I've already mentioned in flying. Nothing was heard of that application by the time I got to Fort Benning. And then, I was obviously very interested during all my time there in whether anything had come through on it, and nothing did. My orders from Fort Benning, completing that course, were to report to the 43rd Infantry Division at Fort Ord, California, this now being in the fall of 1942. So my new wife and I drove across the country to Fort Ord, where I checked in.
How do you spell Ord?
O-R-D.
O-R-D.
Fort Ord is up near Monterey. Beautiful place. I checked in there at Fort Ord and rather quickly learned that the 43rd Infantry Division was being fleshed out, if you will. People were being added, people and equipment, for them to load troop transports for the invasion of Guadalcanal, which became the mission of the 43rd Infantry Division and later on. Because of my education and I guess expressed interests, I was appointed as a regimental communications officer in one of the regiments of the 43rd Division. I'll tell you, at that point I had learned a lot about infantry tactics and how to fight a platoon or a company and so on. I hadn't learned very much about being a communications officer in spite of my education. So, but nevertheless, if you can visualize the period, the 43rd Infantry Division, which was a National Guard division from the Northeast, I think from Massachusetts, it was one of the New England states, had its basic cadre, of senior officers, and the basic cadre of positions, both officer and enlisted, were filled. But there were a large number of positions to be filled with new inputs, I and many others being those inputs. I think a couple of significant things about my brief time at Fort Ord. The regiment to which I was assigned had a sergeant in charge of their communications activities, the regimental communications, who had grown up in that business, and he really knew it. So here is this young second lieutenant coming in to be the regimental communications officer, and I'm sure that sergeant realized he had a heck of a lot to teach me. So he was very busily instructing me in all the things I was going to need to know. We were confined to the post at Fort Ord because of the preparations for boarding the ships being soon. But I got a pass one evening, and my wife was staying in a hotel downtown in Monterey. And so on this pass, we went someplace, got something to eat, and we were walking along the street back to her hotel. And I passed a Western Union office. And I said, let's go in, I want to send a telegram. So I addressed a telegram to the chief of the Air Corps, United States Army, the Pentagon, Washington, And you may remember the 10-word telegrams that was the price package, 10 words. I don't remember the exact text of it, but it said that I had applied for a transfer to the Air Corps, and if they wanted me in the Air Corps, they better be moving fast, something to that effect. Or that something needed to, I had applied, hadn't heard. If I was going to make that transfer, it had to be soon. It was something to that effect. And I signed it and gave the proper military address. Someday I'm going to find the archives of the Pentagon and find that telegram because so I sent that telegram on this evening we were walking the street. Well, it wasn't probably more than a couple of days later that the regimental communications section that I was in charge of was out on a field exercise in the forest there around Fort Ord. Again, as I say, the sergeants were teaching me things I needed to know. When a courier came up and handed me an official dispatch, I didn't know whether this was part of our training exercise or what, but it was an official Army telegram or teletype transferring me to pre-pilot school at Santa Ana, California, and transferred from the infantry to the Air Corps. So it was as I say, I swear that telegram I sent from Monterey had some effect.
It was kind of a brash act for a new second lieutenant, wasn't it? Or
well, of course it was, and probably in some different circumstances, it would have been dealt with in some different way. But so immediately, as I say, I was transferred by that telegraph form of orders to. There was then an Army pre-flight school at Santa Ana, which is down the coast here. And I remember when we got down here and I checked in at Santa Ana for this pre-flight training. My wife and I got a room over on Balboa Island, which is Balboa is down somewhere in the Newport Beach, Santa Ana area. Well, to just very briefly outline that, a few weeks there at Santa Ana in pre-flight, and I was transferred to primary flying school at Tulare, California, up in the San Joaquin Valley, which was a contract flying school. In those war years, many of the flying schools were operated on contract by civilian companies, with the Army Air Corps providing a cadre of management and check pilot kind of activities.
Let me just quickly ask, you transferred there because you already had a certain proficiency in flying, or that was the normal pattern?
That was the normal pattern. The thing that I had the opportunity to do was to go through flying school in grade as a lieutenant, as opposed to the majority of the classes, which were flying cadets that had qualified by other means to be entered as flying cadets. And because I had a large number of flying hours by then, my progress through the Army Flying School was very rapid, and I was permitted to really elaborate a lot on my knowledge and skills, rather than to follow I had to go through their curriculum of flying, but but that was I'd essentially been through most of that, at least for the early parts of flying school. As I remember, a primary flying school at Tulare was 3 months in duration, and I was transferred from there to Lemoore Army Air Base for basic flying school, which was another 3 months. And from there to Williams Air Force Base, or Williams, what they call it then, Williams Field. It was an Army Air Corps field at near Phoenix, Arizona, for advanced flying school. Well,
was this a typical progression for a pilot?
Yes. In 1942-43, that was standard, primary, basic, advanced. And it was the advanced flying schools had been categorized in certain respects. Williams was a twin-engine training school, or multi-engine, but twin primarily. Other flying schools like Luke, also near Phoenix, were single-engine schools. Well, Williams, as I say, was twin-engine, and that was sort of ordained that the graduates were going to go into bombers or transports, but primarily bombers. And for some reason, I'd acquired quite an interest in being a fighter pilot by then. Well, Williams also, as part of their equipment, had a version of the P-38. It was called the P-322, and that was, as I understand it, those 322s had been built for transfer to England under Lend-Lease as the war, before we got into the war. And they were the same as the P-38s that were being built for the Army Air Corps, except they didn't have turbo superchargers. So they were not supercharged engines. But so they had been, for some reason, they weren't transferred to England, and they'd been assigned to Williams as advanced trainers. And so I got an opportunity then to get to do quite a bit of flying in the P-322, and I was doing everything I could to be assigned as a fighter pilot. Well, I guess luck broke again, because I was transferred from Williams with my Army Air Corps pilot's wings to Muroc Army Air Base, which is now Edwards, for what they call it, OTU, Operational Training Unit. So that was to give operational training in the P-38. And after a very short period there at Muroc, I was transferred to Van Nuys, California, where the 364th Fighter Group was being organized. It was a brand new group. It was being just put together from nothing. And so I was one of the first pilots assigned to the 384th Squadron of the 364th Fighter Group. And after a few weeks of flying out of Ontario, out of Van Nuys, my squadron was sent to Ontario, what is today Ontario International. But it was a pretty crude airfield in those days. And so Ontario, California, yeah, which is today a major international airport. So we trained for about 3 months in the summer of 1943 with our squadron flying out of Ontario, and we were doing all kinds of training missions, spending a lot of time on the ranges up at Edwards Dry Lake. They had various targets up there for ground attack training. We did a lot of aerial combat training off the coast along here off Los Angeles, with towed targets and aerial gunnery and dogfighting training. Some of the fun missions I remember were flying at night as targets for the Army Antiaircraft here protecting the Los Angeles area. Our job was to train them in the use of their searchlights. So on a dark night, we'd be way up above Los Angeles, and the object was for the anti-aircraft gunners to get their lights on us. So it was always great sport for us to stay out of their light beams and them to try to catch us.
What was the typical armament on a P-38?
A P-38 had a 20 millimeter cannon in the center of the nose and 450 caliber machine guns around it in the nose. So all of its armament was in that big nose section. It was a good set of armament, all concentrated, and it would punch a good hole in what you were shooting at. We were able to do very concentrated training here for a period of, I guess, about 3 months, flying out of Ontario. And our group was then reassembled up at Santa Maria, California, and put on a train and taken across the country, where we got on the Queen Elizabeth, which was a troop transport in those years. And the Queen Elizabeth took us across the Atlantic to Liverpool. It was our whole group was on that one ship. So our group fairly rapidly then found itself based at a Royal Air Force base that the U.S. Army Air Corps had taken over at Huntington, near Bury St. Edmunds in East Anglia, north of London, in England. We were part of the 8th Air Force, and one of the very first long-range fighter groups in the European theater. The P-38 was the first of the long-range escort airplanes.
What was its range?
The longest mission I ever flew in a P-38 was over 7 hours, and
That was with no stop for review.
oh yes, sure, unrefueled. I'd have to do some checking to tell you the miles. I've just forgotten, but we could. The longest missions we ever flew in distance were over to from England to near the Polish border between Germany and Poland, and return to England. I'd have to look at a map to translate that to miles.
What was your wife doing at this period? Where did she end up while you were going from school to school and then overseas?
She was with me up until I went overseas. Is a quick answer. That wasn't an easy life, but I think as both of us look back on it, it wasn't all that bad either. We got married at Fort Benning. I mentioned that we drove across the country. Somehow I managed to scrape up enough dollars to buy a beat-up old Ford Coupe from an officer in my class whose orders were to somewhere where he didn't need a car. Since I was being transferred across the country, I could use a car, so I scraped up a few dollars and bought his car. So we drove that 1936 Ford Coupe. While I was confined to the post at Fort Ord, she lived in a very inexpensive hotel room somewhere in Monterey. And when I got orders to Santa Ana, we gleefully drove to Santa Ana and found a place that we could afford to rent on Balboa Island. And from there to Tulare, we lived in a rented room in somewhere there in Tulare. We had a rented room while I was in that flying school. Same thing over in Lemoore, California. Same thing at Williams Air Force Base, or Williams Field in Arizona. Our oldest daughter was born in July of '43. So my wife went to stay with an aunt who lived in San Pedro. And our oldest daughter then was born in the hospital in San Pedro, California. I was still at Williams when she was born. And I guess it was that child was about 6 weeks old when I got orders to Muroc Army Air Base for the operational unit training. And we rented we had a motel room in Mojave, California. White's Motel, as it was, I remember. Now, I guess initially we found a place we could rent, which was a house trailer. I remember coming home or coming late in the evening from Muroc one day. I wasn't there very long, and finding both of them crying. A 6 weeks old child and a 22-year-old bride. So life was kind of tough. From there to Van Nuys, where we also stayed in a motel. But when we went to Ontario, we managed to rent a house in Upland, California. We were there about 3 months in this little rented house. And it was really from there that I went overseas. And so my wife and daughter went to Sonora, California, which is up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And the reason that she went up there was that earlier on, when she was in college, some years before, she had come to know that part of California living with her mother. And so she, and having no better place to go, went to Sonora and managed to find a small apartment. So she and our oldest daughter spent the years while I was overseas there in Sonora. And I might add briefly that when the war ended, I was still there at Huntington as a fighter pilot, and as May, which was the victory in Europe, and then August, the victory in Japan, passed, I was the only officer left in our group that had a regular commission. I've already mentioned the source of that regular commission. And at that time, the urgency of getting people home, the millions of men that were all over Europe, there was just a big crush for everybody to get home. And anybody who was still there who had a regular commission couldn't go home. So I was transferred from England over to Frankfurt to the theater headquarters, which was then commanded by Eisenhower as the beginnings of the Army of Occupation in Germany, this being in the summer of 1945. And I applied, well, very early on there were efforts to get families over for those who were going to be assigned there in the Army of Occupation. And so my wife and oldest daughter were on the first ship that brought dependents over, this being in the spring of 1946. So we lived in what I guess you'd call a townhouse in one little section of Frankfurt that was still standing. That's a long answer to your question. What did my wife do while I was moving around?
I'm sure there are many things, but in relation to our future discussion, what was important about your experience as a pilot during the war?
Well, if I wanted to give you a flip answer, it would be surviving, I guess, but it was more than that. There are several things that I think had profound effect on me. The majority of which I think would in one way or another relate to technology. The very early days of radar. I can remember. See, the only communications equipment we had in our fighters were a 4-channel VHF set. It had 4 preset channels, and SCR 522 was its nomenclature. It had 4 preset VHF channels. These would have been in the 100 plus megacycle range. And I can remember as we were crossing the Channel or the North Sea and approaching the coast of Belgium or France or Holland, occupied by Germany, hearing these buzzing sounds in the radio Well, those were some of the early versions of radar, putting out large amounts of energy to get reflected waves back. German radar. I didn't know that at the time, but later on was identified as such. Our early missions were largely bomber escorting bombers. And the anti-aircraft fire was really murderous, and especially for the bombers. And I mention that because very, very late in the war, proximity fuses came on the scene. And incidentally, I did a paper when I was at the Air Force Command and Staff School at Maxwell in post-war years about proximity fuses and what would have happened to the Army Air Corps had they been developed earlier. But my memories of the anti-aircraft fire, the German 88 millimeter anti-aircraft used against the bombers, was the murderous effect. You know, these bombers just had to fly straight and level in their long, almost endless string of bombers going in on a target. And the German anti-aircraft would put up what I used to call, or I guess was officially called, a box of flak, you know, and they just keep that box full as the bombers flew through it. And it was really devastating. And as I said, my own belief, which occurred later, of course, that if the proximity fuse had been developed and available to Germany, that anti-aircraft fire would have been much more devastating, as bad as it was. I'm sure you're aware that in many of those raids, the U.S. would mount 1,000 bombers, and it was not uncommon for 50 or more to be shot down on one of those missions. And just a few brief points about radar, which is what I was really talking about. I can remember when one airplane in each of our squadrons was equipped with some very secret device, which we couldn't be told about, except as pilots we were told when to turn it on and when to turn it off, and under what conditions we could be instructed by the ground to either turn it on or turn it off. And I remember it was called a rosebud, and that was the code name for it. And it was a transponder device being used for early ground radar identification and tracking.
We pause here. I'm at the end of the tape.
Okay.